Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives this afternoon. And a special welcome to those of you who are joining us by YouTube, and a very special welcome to our C-SPAN viewers. Today was supposed to have been a national day of celebration. In John Adams' vision, that is. It was on this day in 1776 that the Continental Congress actually approved the resolution that declared the United States a free nation, no longer part of the British Empire. Adams believed that the second day of July 1776 will be the most memorable in the history of America. As it turned out, we now celebrate the day, the 4th of July, that Congress told the world of its brave action with the Declaration of Independence. This afternoon, Elizabeth Mitchell will tell us about another symbol of our independence, the Statue of Liberty. Lady Liberty stands in New York Harbor as a welcoming beacon for those who come to our shores in search of the American dream. Our guest will reveal how Lady Liberty herself came to our shores. Before we get into this afternoon's program, I'd like to tell you about some exciting things coming up here at the National Archives in the next few days. On Friday, our annual Independence Day celebration will begin at 10 a.m. on the Constitution Avenue steps facing the mall. The highlight will be a dramatic reading of the Declaration of Independence by reenactors portraying Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Ned Hector. Then from 11 to 4, we'll have a program of family activities. Come and join us for some living history and fun on the 4th of July. And it is the best place to watch the parade. Next Tuesday, July 8th at noon here in this theater, we welcome Alan Rems, who will discuss his book, South Pacific Cauldron, World War II's Great Forgotten Battlegrounds. The book recounts the many battles in the Pacific that you probably haven't heard about. If you want to know more about these and all of our upcoming programs, there are copies of the monthly calendar in the lobby, as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive it physically or virtually. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives. The Foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities, and there are applications for membership in the lobby also. Our guest this afternoon, Elizabeth Mitchell, is the author of 2 nonfiction books, 3 Strides Before the Wire, The Dark and Beautiful World of Horse Racing, and W, The Revenge of the Bush Dynasty. She also recently published novella-length nonfiction works for Byliner and The Fearless Mrs. Godwin, about the first female detective in the United States. Her freelance writing has appeared in such publications as The Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, GQ, Glamour, and The Nation. She was also executive editor of George, and before that, features editor at Spin. She's the co-founder of Read This, a volunteer group that delivers books where needed, including to troops abroad, children living in poverty, and public schools with no library. This summer, she's teaching nonfiction writing in the Columbia University's summer session, and today she's here to talk about her 3rd book, Liberty's Torch, The Great Adventure to Build the Statue of Liberty. Please welcome Elizabeth Mitchell.
Hello, how are you? First of all, I would very much like to thank the National Archives for having me here. When you're working on a book like this, you just can't bless the archivists enough, because they are the ones who, beyond any engine searches, will find you materials that you would never find, and they keep them in such great condition, and I can't say enough about their work. I'm going to start the talk by just telling you how I came to this story, because I think I started where probably most people started, which is with the idea in my head that the French government had given the Statue of Liberty to the American government. I feel that I grew up with that story, and it was never refuted. I was at the New York Public Library archives, and in their manuscript division, I was researching something else, but I found that they had the diary of Frederick Auguste Bartholdi. It was from 1871. It was when he came to America to pitch the Statue of Liberty. So I started looking at the diary, and it turns out that he wasn't coming under government auspices. He was just this individual who had the idea to create a massive statue. And he came to America, liking the idea of the American experiment, building a strong democracy, a constitutional government. But he wasn't exactly in love with America itself, and he certainly didn't know anyone here. He was working just off of letters of introduction. So that really shocked me. And so it led me to wonder who exactly was Frederick August Bartholdi. So it turns out that he was, at the time he was 36 years old, he was a middle-tier statue maker. He wasn't extremely famous. He had come from the town of Colmar, and this is actually a very recent photograph, but much of the town still looks like this. It's this kind of storybook-looking town on the border between the border of France and Germany. It's on the French side. It was a town that had some status because it was part of it was one of the capitals of the region, but still it was fairly small. And he was able, though, to have very big dreams in this town. This was his house. His parents were pretty well connected. But when he was 2 years old, his father died, and his mother was left to raise just Frederick August and her son Charles. And so she had great ambitions for him. She herself was educated. She was very much an admirer of the arts. And so she wrote a letter to one of his uncles when Frederick was just a little boy, and said, I see in this boy, he's less than 3 years old, the signs of strong character and strong will. And it's going to be a challenge to shape that will without breaking it. But I see the seeds of a man of sort of great vision. So that was kind of remarkable because it held true through the rest of his life, and it was interesting that she saw it then. But she decided that the only way for him to really make his mark on the world, and the same with his brother Charles, was to move him to Paris. Now, Paris at the time was often struck with turmoil. I mean, there were revolutions kind of rolling through all the time. But it was worth going because that's also where if you had a big idea, it was going to have enough support, you could make the connections that might make it happen. Now, very early on, she started putting him up in art studios and arranging for art instructions from some of the great artists of the day. This actually she got for him when he was still in his early 20s. Here he's an older man, but this is the studio in which he worked. And so he was, from the early stage, a statue maker. He wasn't trying to be a sculptor exactly. He wanted to be the maker of statues. And so that required all sorts of business connections and trying to charm people into donating money to get these things made. When he was still a young man, he entered a piece into the Salon of 1855, or he got it accepted into the Salon. The Salon was the place where people showed their art and possibly tried to create a career. He had done a statue for Colmar that was of a war hero. He got the commission at the very, shockingly young age of 19, and in fact, pushed aside other more established artists to get that commission. And I think a lot of it had to do with his mother's campaigning. But because of that he won a third place prize for that statue. He had made it 1 inch, basically, taller than the doorway of the exhibition hall, so it had to be outside. And because it was outside, it got the attention and also the envy of his peers. So he must have learned at that point the first benefit of doing a big thing. So. From that, he gets basically rewarded with a trip to go to Egypt. And he went with another artist who is more established, Jerome, who's here. And they went off. It was kind of a lark, It was an exotic place to go. It wasn't exactly dangerous, but it was unusual. And Bartholdi decided to teach himself photography. Photography was very, very new. and but he learned the craft, and he decided to photograph all the monuments that he saw, the sphinxes and also to photograph normal life there. And then he became completely enchanted in the country. So here you see him. He's over there on that side, dressed in the native garb. There was a lot of that among this group. But while he was there, he became struck by a few things about Egypt. First of all, the sphinxes and the pyramids. He was amazed by these because he felt that they almost embodied eternity. To us, they might wear away somewhere down the line, but they would stand for all of these millennia. And he was someone who I think had a real sense of the fleeting nature of life. Lost his father when he was 2. He actually, when he was born, was not the first Frederick August Bartholdi in the family. There had been another son who had lived for a brief period of time and then died, and he had the same name. Then he had seen his country rocked by one turmoil after another. So seeing these things in Egypt that could last for all this time was very impressive to him. He came away from that trip saying that he wanted to create, if he got an idea big enough, he would create a colossus that would stun the world. The other thing that was going on there in Egypt was the Suez Canal was being built. In fact, the boat he went on to get to Egypt had Ferdinand de Lesseps on the same boat. And Ferdinand de Lesseps was the man who had decided he wanted to create this thing. And what an amazing creation this was. It was digging 100 miles through Egyptian desert to connect these two seas so that you could cut the trip from Europe to India and Asia down by 2.5 months. You wouldn't have the risk of being destroyed down here around the Horn of Africa. And so that was happening, and it was this age of magnificent creations, people trying to do things of great daring, and so Bartholdi was very influenced by this too. So he decided he wanted to create a colossus. Now this is an artist's rendition of the Colossus of Rhodes. The Colossus of Rhodes was supposed to stand according to histories of the time or after, but around that time, that it was a monumental figure celebrating the god Apollo and sort of thank you for the god's intervention in a particular battle. And it supposedly was in the harbor of Rhodes and had this great stature, and it had been a wonder of the world. So Bartholdi wanted to make that, but he wanted to make it for Egypt. So this is actually Bartholdi's design for the Suez Canal in Egypt. And this was the original place that he wanted to put to me, that looks an awful lot like the Statue of Liberty. This is supposed to be a slave woman because the Khedive, who the ruler at the time, had officially abolished slavery. So it was supposed to commemorate the fact that he had done this, and the headdress is a little lower, but it's still the same draped figure, still the torch. So Bartholdi designs this. He goes back to Egypt a few years later. He meets with the Khedive. He places the model of this down in front of the Khedive. The Khedive takes a look at it, and he seems very unimpressed. He said, well, I'd kind of like the light to come out of her head as opposed to the torch. And so Bartholdi said, yes, that sounds good. Although in his letter to his mother, he said it would not be as good. But I didn't want to argue the point. So anyhow, the Khedive was not impressed. The Khedive was into modernity, and even at the time, this was not exactly a modern design. I mean, you're in a place where the Suez Canal is being built. You're creating dredging machines that can move mountains, and then this man's coming with a basically like a almost Roman statue to put in the harbor. So the Khedive rejected this idea. Now Bartholdi goes back to France. France is rocked by the Franco-Prussian War. Bartholdi serves in the National Guard. He also serves as aide-de-camp to Garibaldi, who was the Italian mercenary who stepped in to try and help the French. And Garibaldi himself was a flamboyant character, and there's interesting things about their relationship and the kind of back and forth Bartholdi went through, half admiring the man, half worrying he was too old to fight the war. But when the war ended, French were defeated, and they had to give away Alsace, which is the territory in which Colmar is located. So basically, Bartholdi had to make the decision. You either stay and you become a German citizen, or you have to leave. He decided to leave. He decided to go back to Paris, where he had had his studio. But when he gets to Paris, his studio is riddled with bullets. All the windows have been blown out, and many of the buildings in Paris were smoldering. It had been the week before what is called Bloody Week. In 1 week, 10,000 Parisians were killed in the streets. And in fact, when he was there, basically people are still burying the bodies in the parks and under the paving stones. It was a fight between the left group in Paris and then these government forces, and they had finally had this moment of reckoning that lasted this week. So Bartholdi comes into the city, just gets what he needs, and then he gets on a boat and comes to America to pitch his idea, which I think shows kind of remarkable resilience, and also it's almost odd. So he redesigns his statue. So over there we have the one for Egypt, and then here's his new rendition for America. But he came to America, and like I said before, he didn't know anyone really here. He had these letters of introduction. He arrived in New York, and at that time, this is what New York looked like at Fifth Avenue and 28th Street. This is a few years before he arrived, but it hadn't, it didn't change that much during the intervening years, 6 years. He originally thought, actually, the statue, he had a few ideas. He did like the little islands out in the harbor when he first came in, but he also thought it was possibly a good thing to put in Central Park or to put in Prospect Park. And so he went to meet with the designers of those parks, Vaux and Olmsted, and in his diaries he has these, he refers to it being, them seeming to be wary of him, and there's, weird, they won't exactly talk to him about his project. And you have to wonder, was it because they didn't really want this massive statue in the middle of their park? Because if you think about it, at the time, the biggest building that was still proposed and not finished was the Dakota. And the Dakota the top of it would have just reached to Liberty's big toe. So there'd be this thing hanging, up over New York. So anyhow, he realized, that probably wasn't going to work. But on that first trip, he actually did go out to the island, Bedloe Island, which is where now called Liberty Island. He met with the general there, and he talks about a very discouraging day there. But also, you can imagine how a general would, how he would feel about having this random French person come to his fort and start telling him how he's going to build this enormous woman. So anyhow, in his frustration, he's getting no traction really to speak of. He heads out west, and he was accompanied by his very faithful assistant, this man, Simon Marie. And it's sort of sad because we don't know very much about this man other than he seemed to be beloved by everyone he met. And he was truly dedicated to Bartholdi, but there's not much we have except things like this. This is their photograph together at Niagara Falls. And they go out all the way, through, he keeps track of everything he sees. He meets with Brigham Young. At first he loves Brigham Young. He thinks he's a very noble man and, and amazingly bright and all that. And that's when he thought he was going to be making a bust of Brigham Young. By the end of the visit, when Brigham Young says, "I'm a little busy today, can you come back the next day?" He says he can go to blazes and and just gives up on him entirely and is annoyed by him. He goes out to San Francisco, goes to the Chinese Quarter. He goes to see the redwoods of California. He sees politicians, the Republicans and the Democrats, hammering it out, and has interesting scenes of that. He is completely swept away by the landscape of the West, the monumental, the cliffs and the chasms that the trains have to go over, and just the ingenuity of making these train tracks. So something out there in America really made him a believer, let's say. So he comes back to the East Coast, and he realizes he doesn't have much to go on. He doesn't have much support, but he's going to try his best to get this thing made. So he goes back to France. He has a few other projects that he's working on, but he gets the services of the Mondoui Iron Works and starts to have a strategy for how they're going to get this thing done. They have to fundraise in France because they have to get it started somewhere. And so his idea is that he's going to have the French raise half the money and the U.S. raise the other half. And it will, the French will probably all rally because it'll be this great, tribute to the relationship between France and America. But actually, the French, they have a great fundraising dinner at the beginning, and then it just goes away. So he doesn't know really what he's going to do to raise money, and so he has to come up with various schemes. He'll have operas, he has, choral concerts, and he then also is always headed towards the fact that in 1876, there's going to be this 100th anniversary of the country, the U.S., and the World Exposition that year was going to be held in Philadelphia. It would be the first World Expo in America. So he wants to build the hand with the torch and exhibit it there. Now, this is a situation, this picture is taken at one of the happier moments for the creation of this. One of the more unhappy moments is he's getting it ready. He needs it to go with him to Philadelphia. He's leaving in May. It's got to be there for sure on July 4th. The Philadelphians have already made a pedestal for it. And he's just about to go, and he hears that the plaster form that they used to actually make the statue has toppled over as they're moving it and cracked, and they have to start the whole thing over again. So he was in quite a sweat that he would have nothing to show. So he goes to Philadelphia and waits for his hand. Eventually, the hand arrives, but it's at the very end of the whole World Expo. But luckily, the weather had gotten a little nicer. He was able to get people to come by and take a look at the torch. But he had thought that this would make Americans crazy with excitement. And instead, what happened was they just were more suspicious because they said, okay, first of all, the drawings we've seen show this big woman, and then there's always like 3 people standing at the base of it. Is there no enthusiasm over in France for even the concept? Second of all, if it took that much money and effort to make just that part, how much more would it take to make the entire woman? So he doesn't get the fundraising that he's hoping for. He ships this up to New York to sit in Madison Square Park, hoping that will make things happen for him. But what he realizes is when it's in Madison Square Park, at first people are interested because it's so big. But over time, they kind of lose interest. They, it just blends in with the scenery. And the difference between when it was here and people were sort of lining up to see it and up in New York is that in New York, it wasn't open to visitors. And so Bartholdi certainly understood people want a thrill. They want fun. They don't want to just look at something and admire it. So he decides that he's got to use this as a way to raise money. In France, he goes to the greatest opera designer, theater designer in Paris, and says that he wants to make the harbor of New York in Paris. So it's a diorama. Dioramas were the main entertainment for people before movies came around. And what you would do is you'd walk into a room and suddenly you'd feel like you were you were dining with Cleopatra, or you had gone from summer to winter in a minute, and people thought they were just the most fantastic way to spend your evening. So he sets one up that looks like the New York harbor, and he really thrilled people. They felt like they walked in and they could feel the sea breezes, and they say, and there's people talking Yankee fashion near you, and you feel you're there. And so they flocked to that. They paid the ticket price. A lot of money was raised through this particular endeavor. Then he went out and set up the head at the Paris Expo in 1878. And there again, this was one of those magical things that made people realize, that he was doing something special. And at this point, a few visitors came to see it, including Joseph Pulitzer, who we'll get to later. But it was a key thing that he actually saw this head near the Champ de Mars at the 1878 World Expo. Now, here's the question of who is the face of liberty. Now, there's a story that goes around that it's the face of his mother. And in fact, some places say he said, yes, it is my mother. But when I went back and looked at the original text that that's based on, it actually didn't happen quite that way. He didn't confirm it. What happened was a senator at a dinner said that he had gone to see this head being made, and then he went to the opera with Bartholdi and saw the mother sitting in the audience and said to Bartholdi, that's the face of liberty, and Bartholdi squeezed his hand, and that was it. And when he tells it at dinner, Bartholdi gets teared up. But Bartholdi never actually said, this is the face of my mother, and it is my belief from having researched this man that he would have said so because he would know that was like, a very heartening thing, that it was the mother. And I actually think if you study the faces, here's the mother. Now, look at how her arched eye, and when she was younger, too, this is after Liberty was built, her nose is extremely narrow, and she has a very thin lip. But then, that's the face, a real close-up of the face. Here's his brother. Now, I think Bartholdi was a person who actually studied faces. I mean, this is what he had to do as a living, was make likenesses of people that were really accurate. And, if I could enlarge that, if I could do that to that, you would see that the brow is very, very similar. In fact, even the crease near the nose is the same basic width, and the mouth has that fuller lip. Now, his brother, I had mentioned earlier, he's the older brother, and when they were growing up, this brother showed greater artistic promise. He also was very smart, and he studied for the law, and he, looked to have a promising law career. But he went mad, and there was this period of time where Bartholdi had the very sad job of taking his brother and institutionalizing him. But he would go to visit his brother almost, every week, sometimes multiple times a week, and just sit with him. And sometimes his brother would be raging, and sometimes he would be very quiet. But Bartholdi would just stay no matter what he was doing. And he always did put the faces of people he loved in his work. There's a church up in Boston where the Brattle Street Church, and Bartholdi did the frieze up there. It's supposed to be pictures of Christian life, and he actually has Garibaldi marrying Bartholdi's mother and Garibaldi, and Lincoln. In one of the images. So that was definitely common for him. And I actually believe that it is the face of the brother. So the funding, started to come in France. Mainly because of these entertainments, and then also they ran a lottery, and everybody just wanted to do the lottery and kind of get rich quick. So they could start building. And I love this photo because here they are in the workshop, and that shoulder just looming over there is so spooky, but it's such a beautiful photo. The actual construction technique was that they would make lattices of everything, and this was all from enlarging a model and breaking it into sections. Then they would cover it in plaster, so there's the plaster on the sleeve is already done. Then they would create boards that would stack together like a topographic map, and those would be the form on which they would hammer the copper. So it was an incredible process, and the copper is only the thickness of 2 pennies stacked together. They would use little hammers or do it, by just little levers that they had. And then when it actually was put in place, in Paris, they made the rivet holes for the whole thing, but just screwed it together, every other rivet hole. But in New York, it's riveted an inch apart for every rivet, which is just incredible. And so, and they would eventually, after they'd hammered everything, they would break apart the molds beneath. And that is Bartholdi there, looking on at the work. So they made it in Paris to sort of test the structure, and also just because Bartholdi was a wise enough businessman to realize that if he put it up, he could have people climb up to the top, and he could actually earn money to build the statue, in America as well, and make up for the funds that had already been spent. So here it is at the Mondoui workshop in a neighborhood that's near Parc Monceau. So if you lived in Parc Monceau's area, this is what you would see as you came out of your house. So over in America, you'd think that this thing being made would make everybody in America decide, okay, now we're going to do our part to raise the money for the pedestal and to put it up. And that, in fact, was an amount that was bigger than the amount to build the statue in France. The papers would do their part, announcing the fact that there was fundraising for it, but nothing was catching on, to the point where Joseph Pulitzer takes a look at the sees an article about this in one of the other papers, and he goes and makes a query with the American Committee and said, how much have you raised? And they had something like $1,300 in the bank. So he is outraged. They have Charles Stone, who was a former Civil War hero who had been disgraced, though, during the Civil War, had spent time in Lafayette prison as a traitor, even though there were never any specific charges brought against him. He was a man who then, when he was released without any explanation for why he had been held in the first place, retreated to Egypt for a while, advised the leader over there, and then came back to America. And as soon as he came back, he got the job of doing the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty, and he was determined to clear his name, to become a hero again. So they had him on the case, but still no money to actually build the thing. They had the workers, a lot of them were from the making of the Brooklyn Bridge, and they were basically, in some points, just on standby. And then they started to create the concrete structure for the pedestal, but sometimes they would just have to stop. And there was this one period of time where they had the structure about this height. They had the statue over in Paris, and everything stopped for about a year. There was no money to do it, and Bartholdi was frantic. Because not only was he frantic because he needed to get this thing done, but he also had to come up with a way to move it out of that workshop, because he couldn't just leave it there forever. And so money was, it was costing money all the time that it was not being built. This is when Pulitzer steps in. So Pulitzer kind of basically hated the rich people of America, but he loved the little man. And so he saw this as a fight of in just those terms, that if the millionaires would just give their money, the thing would be made. And so he wrote an editorial, and he said, let's just forget about them. They're too cheap to do this. We're going to do it. So I'm going to run the name of every person who gives a penny to the fund. And with that, people started giving money to the fund. A lot of them just wanted to see their names in the paper. When they put the name in the paper, the circulation started skyrocketing. And it had been a dead paper, but he built it largely on the back of this project. So he did raise enough money. Liberty came over to America on the boat, the Asir. It almost crashed. There was a terrible storm when it was out at sea, but it finally made it to the U.S. late. There were many other struggles that happened when it first arrived, so there was a whole year where nothing was going on again. But in 1886, they started actually putting it up and putting on the copper cladding, and this is a lithograph made at the time, basically to give the true account of what was going on. And the other thing is that the Americans worked without an exterior scaffolding when they put it up, and even the French thought that was lunacy, that you could just die doing it, and you can see these people hanging off of it to put on the rivets. So Liberty was inaugurated in October 1886. And whereas there had been so little support before, between Pulitzer's drumming up the excitement and the fact that there was a sudden day off given to everybody in New York, people showed up. And Charles Stone, the Civil War hero who needed to be redeemed, it made a parade to end all parades. It was 30,000 marchers. It had a naval parade. Unfortunately, it was a very foggy, rainy day, and if you were on shore, you actually couldn't even see Liberty. But everybody, a million people turned out, and it was a huge celebration, and people were so excited about it that, in the week to come, Bartholdi, when he went on a train up to Niagara Falls, they would stop his train in the tracks just to get a glimpse of him, and they would write articles about how he was a very handsome man and all these things. He actually was the one to rip the flag off of the Liberty's face to unveil her to the world, and it was it's unclear exactly why, but the moment that he unveiled her, it was premature. He was supposed to wait until she was actually officially handed over to the president. Instead, there was a speech being given. The person mentioned the name Bartholdi. The crowd erupted in roars and said, "Bartholdi, Bartholdi," and he yanked the thing off, and the whistles went off, the cannons went off. No one could hear anything else. The ceremony really couldn't be finished, but it was Bartholdi probably, his gesture of just saying, if it had not been for me, this thing would not be there. So anyhow, one other interesting thing is that the scaffolding inside Liberty was an engineering feat. Bartholdi's first engineer was one of the best engineers in all of the world, basically. It was exciting that he had him on board. This was a man who was meticulous with all of his details. Viollet-le-Duc, he usually sketched even the last screw, but he never made sketches of what was going to happen with Liberty. And so they had just raised enough money in France to really build her, and the man drops dead of a brain aneurysm. And so Bartholdi was left in this situation of having this idea, but no way to actually make the thing stand. So he went to the next best person he could think of, and it was the man who had made extraordinary bridges around the world, Gustave Eiffel. And so Eiffel, as we know him, made this inner scaffolding. He said he would only do it, a quick thing. He wasn't going to get very invested in it. But later on, there's reference to the idea that he thought of it as being just an ugly clad, the Liberty being an ugly cladding to his beautiful scaffold. So only a couple of years later, he made the Eiffel Tower, and he made it just a bit taller than the Statue of Liberty, thus taking away its claim to tallest structure in the world. So this is Bartholdi. I love this picture because this is Richard Butler, who, everyone got annoyed at Bartholdi at one point or other. He was a little bit of a peevish guy. He could be funny and emotional and charming, but he also was very demanding. And this man, for some reason, he was a rubber magnet. He never tired of the man. And I think this picture really shows the warmth of their friendship. So Bartholdi, what became of him? You would think that the man who made the Statue of Liberty would live in, fame and wealth. And he had tried actually to, he copyrighted the image of Liberty back in 1876 so that he could, if anyone used an image on a postcard or in an advertisement or, a painting or what have you, he would get some money from it. But it quickly spun out of control, and he never got any money from it. He used to write to Richard Butler all the time, begging him to pursue this or that copyright problem, and Butler tried his best but never could. Bartholdi also felt sort of humiliated because when he thought from this Americans would be giving him commissions left and right, but there was a competition for a statue of Lafayette. Bartholdi thought it was just being given to him as a commission, and then he found out that actually they had invited a lot more artists to compete and given them longer times to put in their piece, and this was when they already had Bartholdi's piece in their model to judge, and he ultimately was rejected for that job. So he didn't get that kind of claim, but he had a very emotional attachment to the Statue of Liberty, and he had married a woman when he was in Newport, Rhode Island. It was a French woman, and there's a lot of mystery around that, and that's in the book. But it appears that he knew her in France. He had brought her over to America mainly so that he could marry her outside the prying eyes of his mother, who was so interested in his personal life. And so, but anyhow, at one point, he writes to the wife. Obviously, she's brought up the issue, and he says, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but childless, because she must have said, that it was sad that they had no children. He said, but what of our daughter Liberty? And so that is not Bartholdi, but that's just the statue. But so there's a lot of irony, and there's some myths that are busted by knowing the true story. But the thing is, it is quite amazing how it is functioned for us, just reminding us all the time of what we're supposed to be. And what would we be without it? I mean, we have a human face that greets people into the country and also is used, as our logo around the world. And it's kind of nice that, more than the flag, we can say this is what we stand for. So it was worth it. And that's it, I guess. We'll go to... And I think we'll take questions now, and I guess it would be good if people could go to the microphones because it is C-SPAN is kindly recording this, so.
Will you talk about Emma Lazarus' quotation?
Yes, I would love to. So the Emma Lazarus poem, which is famously, we know the Give Me Your Tired, You're Poor, was written for a fundraising effort for the Bartholdi statue. It was done towards the tail end of the production of the statue. And this woman in New York had gathered the largest collection of artwork New York had ever seen. There was no Metropolitan Museum of Art at the time, so this was quite an incredible thing. She also approached a whole bunch of writers, and Mark Twain, for example, contributed to that booklet. She went to her friend Emma Lazarus, who was a poet and had gained some fame for her poetry that was bringing to light the plight of refugees from the Russian pogroms. And she said, would you write a poem? And Emma Lazarus thought this was just a kind of scheme of the ego. She didn't think much of it, apparently. And so she said no. And then the friend said, well, what if you think of those refugees? So she went back. She went away. She came back and she gave that poem. And the poem was published the next day in the newspaper, and people really loved it. But then it just disappeared. There was no sign of it anywhere. Emma Lazarus died basically a year later. And then it was some years later when the friend decided to put it on a plaque at the Statue of Liberty and paid for that. Even then, it wasn't really, no one paid attention to it. It wasn't until a journalist in around 1950 saw it and wrote about it, and that started to have more meaning to people. So it really is, encompasses the way we think of the Statue of Liberty now as being this greeting point for immigrants, and it's actually a meaning that's much more, elegant than even what Bartholdi thought. Actually, when the island was being considered as a processing station for immigration, he said that would be an abomination and despicable. I mean, I think he thought that it would cause this busyness or something around his statue. But luckily he didn't, her poem kind of won out over his feelings about that. Any other questions? Oh, sorry.
I walked in at slide 1 or 2, so feel free to skip this if you covered this. Okay. I'm just curious about sort of the genesis of this project, whether it was something that bedeviled you for a long time before you sat down to it, or it just sort of happened, and how it fits with some of your other current passions and obsessions, just the big view of how this project works for you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I originally, it was probably around 2003 that I originally stumbled across the diary in the archives at the New York Public Library. It was in the manuscript division. And I was definitely interested in it at that time. I sort of proposed, that to, my agent, maybe I'd be interested in doing this, following the story, but nothing really came of it at that point. And then I moved on to other things for a period of time, but I always was very interested in the story. And it was later on, I was talking to an editor, a friend, and I said that I always wanted to do this, and he was an editor at Byliner, and he said, please do. And so I wrote it, and then Grove noticed that, the publisher of this book, and said that they wanted the bigger story. So it's very exciting to me that people are interested in the story in the same way that I am, because I held on to it for a while. As there's a certain humanity to it that interests me a lot. I'm sorry.
Where does our Bartoli fountain fit into this saga?
Oh, yes. Well, the fountain actually he created to bring to the 1878 World Expo in 1876, sorry, in Philadelphia. And he actually saw it as a fundraising tool for his Statue of Liberty. He thought he would exhibit it and then some city or town would love it and want to buy it and take it up. But when the expo ended, nobody had shown any interest whatsoever. And he was actually devastated because not only did he not sell it to make the money, but he was going to have to figure out a way to ship it back to, to France. So it was a while before it actually got adopted down here. But also the other thing is that he used copper on that and he had iron fittings on it, and that had an erosion problem for a while. And so later on, when Liberty was having an erosion problem before it even was fully standing, they were saying, he should have learned from his fountain that you can't combine those metals directly. So yeah, that was his process with that.
I commend you on a fine presentation, but I would like to know about the access to the torch. Yeah. I understand when it was opened that people could go up into the torch, and you showed a slide of a person looking over the balcony of the torch.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious as to why it's not any longer, accessible, and what is the access even to the crown now? Is it all stairs? I don't know what
it is.
It's always was stairs.
Yeah, it's amazing. Actually, there was a period of time, even during Bartholdi's time, that he thought that there would be an elevator going up, but it is stairs. And the torch has always been a little bit tricky. I mean, in Paris, no one seems to have had any real problem with going up into the torch. But when it came to America, I found these funny accounts of the workmen who are putting it together, the ones on the American side, and they said, yeah, we think that torch is going off in the first hurricane, and also we ended up with this massive piece of copper, and we have no idea where it goes. And so it's possible that it actually was part of where the arm was, because the arm was put in about 18 inches off its alignment that it was supposed to have. So this was continuously unstable. And so there were only sort of fleeting times when it was open to the public, and now it's just too risky. Although I have seen accounts that it was, I think maybe it's different now since Hurricane Sandy, but there was one family who lived on Liberty Island as the caretakers of the statue and the land. And so there are these accounts that the teenage boys used to be able to get up into it, and which would have been quite impressive, I think, to their friends, if you can say, we'll go up there and hang out.
I believe that the torch was originally open to the public, and then before we got involved in World War I, there was a munitions explosion on the Jersey side of the island, and the torch which slightly damaged the torch, and it's been closed to the public ever since, with no plans of reopening it.
Yeah, thank you. It was a fleeting moment. There were accounts at the time of the people going up all the way. There was a woman even, women weren't actually invited to the inaugural, other than Bartoli insisted that his wife go, and then Ferdinand de Lesseps insisted that his 13-year-old daughter also be allowed to attend. But no other women were allowed to go. But on the day of the inaugural, one woman went to the island and actually climbed all the way up to the torch, and this was, and it was in the papers and everything about how she had done it, and then she was quickly hustled off the island. But yeah, there was a brief period when they could do that. Anyone else? Thank you. Okay.
We found it. So as a little token of your appearance today, a replica facsimile from our collection, which is the deed of gift of the Statue of Liberty.
Oh, I'm going to get emotional. Thank you.
Have you ever seen it?
I have never seen it in
Isn't it
real
beautiful?
life. I've seen it, described. I read the account when General Stone is giving this in New York Harbor, but this is beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
It's gorgeous.
And we can, if it's easier, we can mail this to you, or you can take it, whichever.
I can take that.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Folks, we hope you'll join us one level up at the Archives bookstore. There is a book signing immediately following the program.